Hi, welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the second one in a series of videos dedicated to getting started in humanistic psychology. In other words, getting an idea what the lay of the land is about and the general direction of humanistic psychology, introducing you to some basic vocabulary so that when we get started with the actual books for this class, you'll already have a sense of direction. You'll already more or less know what the main themes are going to be, which I think will make the class much more easily assimilable and digestible by you, the tuition-paying West Georgia student. So to start things off, let's get this crazy professorial hair that's getting way too long due to the coronavirus under control with a little bit of West Georgia, go West, go Wolves swag. So here's your hat of the day. I'm sort of trying to get it so you can still see my face. Okay, so in the last video in this series, video number 1, we talked a little bit about what humanistic psychology is generally, first by way of a sequence of negations. So we described it as a non-atomistic, non-deterministic, and non-reductionistic school of psychological thought. And then we went into some detail about what that means. And then we described it a little bit more positively in terms of this construct, holism, and we noted that holism basically has two parts or dimensions. The first of which, holism, is the attempt to see all of what we are in terms of all of what we are without diminishing or demoting any part of what we are. And then the second part has to do with seeing all of what we are in terms of the many interrelated contexts that we inevitably habit as we move through our lives. And that brings us up to this video. So here comes the new stuff. The first task for today is to draw out some of the implications of holism so that you have a better idea of what it's about. So I think it's obvious at this point that from a holistic point of view, we human beings can't really be reduced to any of our parts or any of our contexts. In essence, humanistic psychology embodies the idea that life is basically irreducible, and that the desire to reduce it, more or less because of our desire for simplicity and relatively simplistic understandings, is really a way of missing the whole point. The point is that we're thrown into this existence which has various layers of complexity to it, and if we really want to understand what we're going through, we have to come to grips with that complexity and devise a way of understanding things that opens its arms wide enough to embrace that fundamental complexity. So we're not reducible to any of our parts or contexts. We're also not reducible to the sum of our parts, okay? So, and the reason why is because we're always more than the sum of our parts, and that may seem like an odd thing for you to hear. So let me take a few seconds to maybe flash you onto something that might help you understand it. So if you have the idea that, well, one way of doing psychology would be to sort of understand all of our component parts and how they interrelate and thereby come up with an account of what we are. Well, the thing about what we are is that we're not just the sum of all the stuff that we've been through in the past and that we are in the present, because we're also oriented toward possible futures. Okay, so you can't just sort of add up all the stuff that's been there in our lives and that is there in the present, because part of how we move through our lives is anticipating possible futures and possibilities for ourselves. So that whole effort is probably going to fall short because it doesn't take that very futural orientation that we have into account. So another implication at the start of your notes on the beginning of this page. From a holistic point of view, you can't understand a person's, say, feelings without knowing how they connect to his or her thoughts, relationships, values, spirituality, etc. Right? So all of the different parts of ourselves are interrelated from a holistic point of view. So you can't just understand sort of feelings themselves, as it were, separable from all the other dimensions of our lives. You can't just understand our thoughts themselves as though they were separable from everything else. You can't understand whatever our values as though, and so on down the line. All right. So in the clinical sphere, you can't understand a person by reducing that person to a collection of symptoms or even a diagnostic label. But maybe this seems a little bit abstract to you, so let's bring it home a little bit in the form of student life. okay? Because most of you watching this are probably my students. I'm sorry, I keep itching because I've got all these mosquito bites on me. I'm sorry about that, so I might be sort of itching my body a little bit throughout these videos. I noticed on the last video I kept doing that, and what it is somehow I got into a nest of mosquitoes or something. I was repairing a pump outside actually, and probably they chewed me up while I was doing that. So, okay, that's more than you need to know at this point. All right, so let's translate this into student life. That's what I was getting at before I got sort of bugged, as it were, by the mosquitoes. So there's more to you than your SAT score. There's more to you than your grade point average, okay? Although those kinds of things, I guess, are important components to the larger picture, they can't hope to capture all of the, you know, subtle gradations of experience and adventure and victories and defeats you go through at this point in your life. Let's say you're approximately 20 years old, kind of the 18 to 22 range of your life. Like, they can't hope but fall short of capturing like all the subtle gradations of you know, feeling and experience and you know, spiritual growth and development, you know, that you go through at this point in your life. So even if you have a high grade average, well, that's good, you know, in terms of your social advantage, and it is marker of a certain kind of accomplishment. But then again, there are parts of you that won't be describable in terms of your high grade average. They won't be touched by the, let's say, of a 3.7 or something, your high grade average, you know. Okay, so there's more to you than that. It's the same basic idea. There's more to you than, let's say you have a DSM diagnosis. There's more to you than that. There's more to you than the psychometric processes that are used to confirm your diagnosis and so on. All right, so all sounds well and good, I'm guessing, but there's a kind of problem that seems to be arising if you think about this. And the problem is, it seems like from this point of view, if you can't, in a way, sort of understand people's feelings without understanding all the other dimensions, then, like, how do you even sort of talk about one aspect of a person's life without having to drag in all the other aspects of a person's life? It's almost like you can't begin to say, in a way, the first thing, because in order to say the first thing, you have to say everything, in a sense. All right, so that might seem to be a you know, a kind of complaint you might have, but here's the response to that. See, from a holistic point of view, you can talk about one aspect of a person's life. Like, you can talk about, let's say, spirituality or something like that, and talk about it at some length without having to drag in all the other dimensions of a person's life. What this emphasis on holism is about is it's a cautionary emphasis. Okay, you can still talk about, let's say, feelings, but the holistic emphasis cautions us not to forget that as we're talking about feelings, we're implicitly talking about all the other dimensions of a person's life. So it's not, if you get the idea that, well, this holistic emphasis is sort of a kind of prohibition against talking about any one aspect of anyone's life, that's not really it. It's more, you can still talk about one aspect of a person's life, but the holistic emphasis cautions us not to forget that as we talk about one aspect of a person's life, we're really talking about a whole human being still, and all the other dimensions and all the other contexts are there too. All right, so okay, I guess the next thing in your notes, I said you're not just a batch of feelings any more than you're just a batch of thoughts, any more than you're just a batch, than you're just a body, any more than you're just a batch of social relations, any more than you're just an unconscious, any more, and so on down the line. You know, you're all of those things and more, okay? Because you're oriented toward possibility and futures. That's the and more part. All right, now implication. I said this kind of very briefly in the last video when I was kind of going on about holism, and I said, well, holism includes all the different dimensions. And I sort of mentioned in passing the soul, and I said, well, isn't that interesting that, you know, this holistic approach would tend to take people's spirituality seriously? And let's talk about that for a second in a little bit more detail. So yeah, like if you experience life in terms of a spiritual dimension or in terms of religious conviction or religious passion or something like that, a holistic approach is inclined to take that seriously, like the spiritual dimension of your life or the soul dimension, however you want to think about it, okay? Like a holistic approach is inclined not to reduce that either, okay, and just say, well, it's unimportant or something like that. Like if people experience spirituality as important, a holistic approach, and humanistic psychology, I guess more specifically, is inclined to take that seriously as an important dimension of people's lives. This is not how it is necessarily in some other mainstream schools of psychology, and I gave you a couple examples in your notes. Like Freud, for instance, had a very jaundiced view, I would say, of people's religious lives, and in a kind of famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, work called The Future of an Illusion, he outlined by the title of the book, you can kind of get the idea that this is not going to be a terribly charitable rendering of people's religious or spiritual lives, you know, the future of an illusion, okay, you know, so you can almost tell where this is going to go. Well, sort of Freud had it that, you know, speaking of, let's say, Christianity, you know, the predominant religion in the West, in the Western world, it's really about people's sort of fixations in earlier incomplete stages of development. That what people are looking for in their religious lives is a kind of sort of master parent figure in a way, you know, like our Father who art in heaven, you know, or Mother Mary full of grace, okay? So, you know, this kind of nomenclature is no accident for Freud that we tend to use so often in the Christian world, you know, the language of father, you know, and mother for that matter. It's because what we're really looking for is the ultimate parent figure, and the reason why we're looking for the ultimate parent figure is because somewhere in childhood we didn't get what we needed to move ourselves into complete adulthood. So we're looking to have that sort of incomplete childhood experience be recapitulated and hopefully successfully in later adult life. And that's why we're still looking for our Father who art in heaven, okay, or Mother Mary full of grace, you know, that sort of thing. This is Freud's take on it. That it's really about a kind of stuckness or fixation, and we're looking to complete something that didn't happen successfully in childhood. Okay, so, you know, it's not as though that rendering is necessarily completely false. I bet for some people it is kind of like that, you know, that to some fraction of people who would claim to be religious are looking for the ultimate master parent figure because they really want to have that. And why did they really want to have it? Because they didn't get it when they really needed it. But the other side of the coin is, I bet that's not true for everyone. You know, for some people, I think there's more to their religious lives or their spiritual lives than merely looking for the parent that they never had. Okay, so if you ask people, you know, people who are religious about, like, well, what's it sort of all about? Ultimately, if you're honest, right? Usually we're not very honest creatures, we human beings, but if you got honest answer, you know, some people might say, yeah, okay, Freud was right, but other people might say, well, I think there's something more to it than that. Like sort of the depth and the sort of luminous nature of spiritual experience, or the numinous nature of experience, you know, really seems like a lot more than just looking to replace the bad parent you had when you were a kid. All right, so it's, for some people, this sort of Freudian take sort of doesn't work. Similar kind of deal with respect to behaviorism. Okay, so let's shift from psychoanalytic thinking to behavioristic thinking. So like Skinner, well, the reason why you whatever, read scripture or memorize scripture or go to church is because those are behaviors that you, in one way or another, have been rewarded for. And the reward system may be very you know, tricky and complicated and so on. It may be sort of embedded within the social matrix that the larger society rewards you for engaging in behaviors like that, or odds are you got rewarded for it when you were a kid, like, so when you went to church and, you know, whatever, you could say the Lord's Prayer, which I was referring to earlier. You know, they said, well, good boy, you know, or good girl, or good hermaphrodite. You try to include everyone in the 21st century, you know, whatever you are. Good cyborg. Good cyborg. You memorized the Lord's Prayer. All right, so that's his take on it. Once again, perhaps for some people that is true, that really their religious life is just, you know, stuff they've been rewarded for doing, you know, but I bet not for everyone. For some people, if they were to hear Skinner's take on, you know, their religious lives, they would say something like, well, I think there's something more to it than that. Seems a little bit deeper, seems a little bit more profound, seems a little bit more powerful than just, well, you know, I'm a poodle jumping through the hoop. Basically, it seems like there's something more to it than that. It's just that the hoop we call spirituality, you know. All right, so for some people, these are misgivings or problems with mainstream psychology, that it fails to address or integrate their spiritual religious lives in a way that seems real and satisfying. Well, humanistic psychology tends to honor people's religious experience. In fact, a lot of the time it says it's not just that it honors those kinds of experiences. A lot of the time it wants to actively investigate them, like they're indicators of some of life's highest moments, you know, like for instance, for Abraham Maslow, whose book you'll be reading later in the semester, you know, when he looks at peak experience, well, one of the prime examples of peak experience is something like religious epiphanies and moments of deep revelation and stuff like that. So it's not just that humanistic psychology honors people's spiritual experiences. It kind of is really interested in them, more interested than, you know, whatever, you know, something more mundane. Okay, now here we have to take a little bit of a sidebar moment to diffuse a kind of bomb. And the bomb goes something like this, that sometimes people confuse humanistic psychology with the doctrine of secular humanism. Why do they do that? Because they kind of both have the word humanism in them. All right, so these are not the same thing. Okay, because at this point, because we are at the University of West Georgia, and because Christianity is such a strong and potent force in the South of the United States, we have to take a minute or two to sort of disentangle this kind of stuff, because people will often have the misgiving when they are in this class, like, well, gee, you know, because of the name humanistic, like, can I still be religious? Can I still be an ardent theist and learn from humanistic psychology and even become a kind of humanistic psychologist? And the answer is going to be, yeah, you can. Okay, spoilers, yeah, you can. You can still, you don't have to drop off your religion at the door or pretend like you don't have it or something like that. I mean, that would just be fake and phony anyhow. That would be against like the whole sort of ethic of authenticity that runs throughout humanistic psychology in the first place. So, the doctrine of secular humanism, which basically says that, you know, constructs like God and religion and the soul and stuff like that are all just sort of human constructs. It's all human fabrication, and that there's nothing really to it, is not the same as humanistic psychology, because humanistic psychology does what I said earlier, which is, like, if you have a religious life and experience things in spiritual terms, it's inclined to take that seriously. It's not inclined to demote or diminish or reduce it, like Freud did, to bad parenting in essence, or like Skinner did to the contingencies of reinforcement. In other words, like how you've been rewarded for certain kinds of religious type behaviors. It's not, that's a way of reducing the complexity of people's religious and spiritual lives. Well, humanistic psychology isn't inclined to do that and participate in that. So it's inclined to listen to you. Like if you have a spiritual story to tell, it's inclined to listen to that story and take it seriously, you know, especially if it's grounded in experience and you can speak about your religious experience and epiphanies and stuff like that. So the main point here in this little sidebar moment is, yes, you can be a Christian, you can be whatever you are, you can be a worshiper of Odin or, you know, whatever your religious thing is, you know, the great coconut god, whatever you got going on in that world. You don't have to sort of pretend like it's not there. You don't have to drop it off at the door. Are there ardent theists among humanistic psychologists? You bet. Yeah, buddy, there sure are. Are there atheists among humanistic psychologists? Yeah, there are. Because if you experience things in atheistic terms, it's inclined to take that seriously too. Are there agnostics? What's an agnostic? That's someone who believes that we don't really know enough to say whether God exists or not. Okay, yes, there are agnostics also. And there's even a fourth category of people with respect to this question. You might wonder about what the fourth category is, because, well, I guess either you believe God exists or you believe God doesn't exist, or you have the idea that we don't know enough to say one way or the other. What's the fourth category? The fourth category is people who don't care enough to have any of the other three positions. It's like the question doesn't really matter to them. They're up to other things in their life, and so they never really consider. Are there people like that in humanistic psychology? Yeah, there are. Okay, so there are theists, atheists, agnostics, and people who just don't care about the issue at all. They're all sort of included under the umbrella of humanistic psychology. So that's the deal about that. Okay, so now, next question. So end of sort of sidebar thing. See, I wanted to defuse that bomb because, you know, so often students in this class have that kind of worry, especially early on when they are sort of wondering like, well, gee, am I going to get dosed on something that is really like fundamentally antagonistic to how I see life and see the world and all of that? And it's like, well, not really. You're gonna, if you hate humanistic psychology, you're gonna have to find a better reason for hating it than that, because that doesn't actually work, you know. Okay, so all right, so next question. Now, how does humanistic psychology take up the findings of natural science psychology? Does it reject the validity of their findings? Answer is no. And if you've been understanding what we've been saying about holism, this should be sort of obvious. Sort of like in the last video, I went on, whatever, like 15 seconds, I was going on about biological psychology, and I said, there's nothing inherent in biological psychology that necessitates the further assumption that all there is to us is biology. Okay? Remember when I said that? Oh my God, your memory's so retentive. I am freaking impressed with you. Okay, so, but there's more to life than your grade average, remember that too. Okay, so the answer, does humanistic psychology, how does it take up the findings of natural science psychology? Does it reject their validity? No, it surely does not. Okay, so when we study neurotransmission, that's part of the holistic totality too. You getting it? Like how your body works is part of the holistic totality too. How you've been rewarded for certain kinds of behaviors and punished for other kinds of behaviors, that's part of the holistic totality too. How you're embedded in the social historical matrix, that's part of the holistic totality too. How your unconscious functions, that's part of the holistic totality too. So one way of thinking about humanistic psychology is that really what it's about is a kind of unified field theorem, if you can hang with that physics metaphor, all right? A unified field theorem that integrates all the other schools of psychology. That would be one way of thinking about humanistic psychology, and especially, you know, if you sort of understand what we're saying about holism. So it doesn't reject any of those findings. What it rejects is the totalizing tendency that sometimes accompanies those findings. All right, so it's not a renunciation of biology. You getting it? It's not a renunciation of chemistry. It's not a renunciation of any of the natural sciences or any of, you know, the insights that derive from them with respect to the human psyche. Okay? It's not a renunciation of any of the findings of social psychology or sociology or anthropology or philosophy or anything else. It's not a way of renouncing any of that. It's a way of renouncing the totalizing tendency. The tendency to say, that's all we are. That's what humanistic psychology rejects. You getting it? The totalizing tendency, not the validity of the findings themselves and the insights themselves. It rejects the totalizing hubris type tendency that often accompanies them. So that's an important point. So how does it take up these findings then? Well, what it does is it attempts to, I said in your notes, radicalize the findings of natural science psychology. Now here, because that word radical has sort of been twisted and warped by way of our social linguistic practices, I'd like to sort of draw your attention to the fact that we get the word radical from the Latin word radix, radicus, third declension if you studied Latin, which means root, like the roots of a tree, the radix, right? So the roots of a tree, you know, and the roots of the tree, of course, are where it's grounded in the earth. This is a metaphor, okay? So it attempts to radicalize it, to get to the root of natural science, psychology, and even the natural sciences generally when you think about it. And what the root inevitably is human reality as we experience it, okay? So let me, that's a dramatic thing, and I want to underscore the drama of this moment by, you know, inviting you to reflect on where we get scientific, not just natural science psychology type truths, but where we get even natural science type truths in the first place. Like, isn't it the case that in order to observe something in the natural world such that you can infer the principles that govern it, you have to experience? Observing something is a kind of experience. You getting it? Like observing something in your chemistry labs, if you're taking chemistry, is a kind of experience. In other words, like what seems to be the monolithic, unassailable validity of scientific principles is really based upon something very subjective, okay? Why? Because observing things is a subjective process. There is no perception as such of the world without your experiencing it as a perception. Okay, so the camera shut off, but at any rate, the main point, what's the main point? That humanistic psychology, in contrast to most, not all, modes of mainstream psychology, is a lot less like a natural science and a lot more like a mode of philosophy or literature or something like that. So, another big difference, and this will be sort of the last idea in this video, and it's sort of the crescendo, as it were, I think, of this video, at least in my mind. Okay, so natural science psychology tends to focus on obtaining certain knowledge about an ultimately deterministic universe. Okay, so what you might be inferring at this point is that the model of the universe upon which natural science psychology tends to be based is not a 20th century physics model, you know, which contains things like the Schrodinger's cat paradox and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and things like that that tend to destabilize the idea of an ultimately deterministic universe. Instead, it's based on the model of Newtonian mechanics. And I'm laughing because I wish it were a joke, but it's not. Okay, or if it is, maybe it's a bad joke. So, in contrast, humanistic psychology sees reality as permeated with indeterminacy, and that word's in big block letters in your notes. So let's talk a little bit about what indeterminacy means. Well, the first and obvious thing would be that it's the opposite of determinacy. So there's something about life, because life is irreducible, as I said earlier, because life is not completely determined, because you and I are free, or so it seems, because we are also at the same time responsible as a function of our freedom, reality itself is permeated with a kind of elusiveness. Yes, things can be known, but they can never be known completely. That there's always something that undercuts our project of knowing everything in an ultimate sense, because life has a kind of mystery to it, a kind of mysterium tremendum, as we might say in the Latin of my youth. Okay, so that means a tremendous mystery that attends our understandings of the world and ourselves. Okay, so from this point of view, even as you know things and learn things that are sensible in college, the deeper reality is that you're swimming in an endless sea of mystery, and that everything you know and learn points to things that are yet unknown and unlearned. Okay, so the question here is, how do you see reality? All right, It's a big question, man. This is an important one. How you see reality. The reason why it's so important is because if you see reality a certain way, you should probably not be a humanistic psychologist. Okay? So if you see reality another way, then maybe you should become a humanistic psychologist. So this question of how you personally see reality, this is a big freaking deal. Okay? So, do you see reality as ultimately miraculous, as ultimately mysterious, as pregnant in a way, with boundless, unfathomable mystery and elusiveness? Because if you do, well, maybe you're cut out to be a humanistic psychologist. If you think that life always offers us a beyond, right? That our understandings are always open to being questioned, revised, somewhat contradicted by the larger arc of reality itself. You're sort of on board with this humanistic type approach. If you have the idea that all of our pretensions to certainty, absolute certainty about things, are nothing more than that, just pretensions, and it will only be a matter of time until life undoes our hubris and teaches us that things are way more tricky and way more complicated than we thought they were. Well, you know, for some people this is a negative aspect, and the reason why it could be negative is that it undercuts some people's sense of security. Okay, it makes them feel too queasy and too anxious to sort of think of life and the universe as permeated with something that is ultimately mysterious or unknowable or magical or something like that. It sort of makes them feel like too weird and too out of control. So if you're that kind of person, probably this course is going to irritate you, like for the next 14 weeks of your life. And so the question is, like, do you really need to be irritated for the next 14 weeks of your life? Because here's the deal about life. Life is way too short for you to be spending a huge fraction of it being irritated. So good thing we're mentioning this before the drop ad period ends. For other people, this is exactly the reason to study humanistic psychology, or to take some kind of approach that's like that, because it tends to loosen up what would otherwise be the rule-driven constrictiveness of an ultimately deterministic universe. Like for some people, it just feels too narrow and too sort of constricted and too, like, you know what I mean? Like you're sort of too much in a box or something like that. So it makes life seem sort of robotic and mechanical. And so what people of that persuasion are looking for is a sense of adventure. All right, they want a way of seeing life and understanding the human psyche that sort of amplifies the sense of adventurousness of things. And you know, well, why not? You know, why shouldn't you live your life as an adventure rather than as a robot? I mean, that's my personal point of view. If you have a different one, that's fine too. You know, but you know, that's why I like teaching this class, you know. And, you know, I've gotten old enough, I'm 60 now, so that, you know, I like to do things that I like to do. God, that sounds so simple, doesn't it? Oh my goodness, I hear the cat walking around over there. Didn't know the cat was in the room. Talk about mystery, right? So you never know when there's a cat in the room, like Schrodinger's cat. Okay, so, all right, so the other cool thing about seeing the world as permeated with indeterminacy is it amplifies the sense of your fundamental freedom and responsibility. You know, if you're just sort of being sort of manipulated by some set of deterministic forces, you know, it sort of diminishes your freedom, diminishes your responsibility. You can go around in your life being like triggered all the time because you're seeing yourself as kind of an inanimate object and not as a person who chooses how you think about things, chooses how you react to the world, and so on and so forth. But the big question here is the one at the very end of this page of your notes. The big question is not how I feel. The big question is, how do you feel? And like I said, that is a big question. You ought to be thinking about this, right? Because this question, like how you see reality, right, in a real fundamental way, is going to prefigure your movement through psychology, or whether you should even be a psychologist at all. So I think it is a very strategically sound and salutary thing for you to be doing at this point in your young careers, is like, how do you see life? How do you see life? Like, what matters and what doesn't? What seems to matter, but not really when you think about it. You know, how do you see reality as a whole? Like, and I guess to end off, I'll give you how I see it. Like, Like I said, I'm 60 years old, so I've reached the point where like I'd be satisfied with nothing less than living in the most powerful, interesting, bold, brilliant, musical, magical, miraculous world possible. And anything that helps me understand that world in a way that heightens and intensifies that sensation is something I'm going to go with. But, like I said, that's just me. And the important question is, what about you? Okay, have a good one. Take care. And wonder about reality today, all right? Independence Day, that's when I'm making this. So wonder about the world you're inhabiting and the life you're leading. Take care. Have a good one.